and with the tradition that's passed on, we've learned a lot more about God, and in particular, that's really captured what we believe. It's distilled in the creed really well. And so that's kind of probably some of the things you spent some of the early parts of the class talking about. And then from there, once we learn about what God reveals about himself, it's really about moving into the sacraments. And now it's God making his divine life present to us, okay, through the sacraments. And the celebration of the Christian mystery is what that section is entitled. So now we're kind of moving into another section with this, and we're talking about the next section. The third part of the catechism is the life in Christ, the moral life. And so we know about God. We know he's making his divine life present to us in the sacraments. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to respond? How are we going to live our lives in Christ and with Christ? And that's really what we're just kicking off tonight. And then, of course, the fourth part, which I know you've touched on this, obviously, but Christian prayer, obviously a huge part of it. We'll touch on it tonight, too, how it interplays with helping us to grow in our morality. But let's start with just a question, and this is a question to you all. What is morality? How would you define it? Anyone?
I was looking kind of about morals and ethics, but morals are what is and ethics are what ought to be.
So morals, what is versus the ethics is what ought to be. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that before, but I kind of, that's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah. Anybody else? Like any other back here?
Well, we look at morality a little bit about, she said it is the way we want them.
The way we want them. Okay. Yeah. Okay, all right. So how we wish the world was, yeah. All right, this is pretty good. Anything else? Any other thoughts on that?
I think of your morals as like your wiring, what makes you.
Okay.
Morality would be ideally what we're supposed to act and be like.
Okay, the way we're supposed to act and kind of related to the way we're wired, yeah, with our morals. All right, those are really good. Sometimes people just break it down to say morality really is just a kind of looking at the right, looking at there's a right decision and a wrong decision, or the right and wrong, kind of evaluating for anything that we do, what would be the right thing to do, what would be the wrong thing to do. But there's, I think the definitions you had are really good. But this leads us then to say, if we do think that morality has to do with making a right decision or a wrong decision, if any decision, if we're looking at it from a moral perspective, could have a right component to it or wrong, then how do we know? How do we evaluate what's right or wrong? Some people would say, well, I'm a law-abiding person. I don't break any laws. I let bygones be bygones, and therefore I'm a moral person, right? And that's not a bad way to look at it. I mean, certainly the law, you would hope that our law would follow along with the moral code. However, we can just look back in the past, even in our own country, with something like slavery, right? To know that there were laws on the books that now we look back on and we say, those were unjust, those were not moral laws, that the law of the land said that this activity, and this is just one example, it was fine. So, the law can change through time, so maybe it's not the best definition of defining what is right or wrong. Sometimes people look at something differently, like public opinion. So, if the majority of people believe something should be allowed, then it should be allowed. And this relates in some cases to the law. If we pass new laws or new amendments and things like that, we can change our laws based on public opinion. But, we realize that just like even more so probably with the law, that public opinion can change very quickly. If you look back in our not too, distant past, we can look at public opinion leading to really atrocious things happening in Europe with like the rise of Nazism and fascism. And so, public opinion can change very quickly, even within like one generation. Again, not necessarily the best definition for right or wrong. And related to this particular way of viewing, or what some people would think about public opinion, there's a good quote here from St. Augustine that right is right even if no one is doing it, and wrong is wrong even if everyone is doing it. So, you might be in a crowd of 10 people and 9 people are doing this whatever it is. If you know deep down that whatever that is wrong, you should still not do it. Now, I have teenagers, as I've said, so this is something that I've tried to instill in them, but it goes for all of us that even if everyone's doing something, or if everyone's not doing something that we think we should be doing, we have to do the right thing. Now, what about this idea of conscience? And this is really kind of looking at like that inner voice. We're going to spend a little bit more time with this in just a moment, but with conscience, I kind of look at this idea of like a little angel or a little devil, kind of, should I do this? Should I not do this? We have this kind of inner voice that might speak to us, and a lot of times, we can trust this voice, but we have to try to inform our conscience, which we'll talk about in a moment, but if sometimes it can get off kilter, and so sometimes we kind of our conscience itself can be swayed by the public opinion or by our friends, or maybe we've just been misinformed on some things. So we have to be kind of careful with that, but it is something that we'll come back to in a moment as a way that we can look at what's right or wrong. But of course, for us, we can also look at what was revealed by God. And so whether that's in the divine scriptures or if it's in like our tradition, we can look at what does God say about this, and what does the church have to say about certain issues as some way to evaluate what's right or wrong. And of course, here we think about like the 10 Commandments, right? Of looking at how we should give proper respect to God, and also how we should treat each other, right, as a basis for looking at what's right or wrong. Of course, we're living in a society now that just basically is beginning to disregard that last point about basing our morality on what's revealed from God. And this is not just a recent trend. I mean, back to the 1800s, Dostoevsky made this quote, which seems kind of extreme, but it's kind of interesting. So let's kind of play this thought experiment. What Dostoevsky said is, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Now, I know some people might look at that and say, oh, I don't know about that. Even you might have good friends that are atheists, that are very moral people. But I think what Dostoevsky is getting at is that if there's no God, there's no absolute way to evaluate what's right or wrong. So let's go with this just a little bit more. Now, when I used to teach RCIA, I taught 7th graders, and one of the things when we were talking about morality is we would talk about, if we look at a timeline of everything that's happened, and this could be your life, or it can be over the whole Bible timeline or something like that. But we talked about with the kids, just think about with your life. Now, we tend to think about things in the past, like regrets. Oh, I should have done this differently, or I wish I would have, if only I knew then what I know now, those kind of things. So we look in the past, or we worry about what's coming down the road in the future. But what we would try to get the kids to see is, what is the most important time? It's not the past, that's already done. It's not the future, that's not here yet. It's the here and now. That's the most important time, because that's the time where we can make decisions. That's the point where we can actually do something, and make decisions about how we should act. And so this led us to talking about, if we look at our lives as a journey, where are we trying to go? What is the goal of our life? And beyond just jobs and things like that, we would talk with the students about if we ultimately want to be able to spend eternity in heaven, we need some way to be able to reliably guide ourselves to get there, just like any journey, right? And so we use this example of like a compass, right? And so if we have a map, we have a compass, we can find our way on a journey, right? So we can think back to the conscience that we were talking about a moment ago, and we can think about the compass as being kind of like that conscience, okay? I can kind of tell if a decision I'm making is right or wrong. But what we would talk about with them is to say, just like a compass, it can be influenced by things and can be kind of thrown off of true north. And so we use this idea of like a magnet, right, that's interfering with a compass. And so, we might normally kind of think of something as like, I think that that's wrong. But if everybody around us is saying it's right, it is very difficult to make that right choice. And in fact, you can actually begin to think, well, maybe I am wrong. And so that's the example of this compass kind of having an interference. So it's hard to orient ourselves to make those right decisions with those outside influences. And then we add to the fact that a lot of people would say nowadays, well, there's really no such thing as a moral compass or a conscience or anything like that. There's no such thing as God. If it feels right, do it. It's all about what we would want to do. And that makes it even, I think, very hard to make the right decision. Again, not to say that some people that don't believe in God don't live very morally upright lives, but again, it's that we don't have that absolute true north to orient by, and it's very difficult to live that kind of life. And in fact, what we're living in right now would be this period of large-scale moral relativism. How many people have heard that phrase before? So several. With moral relativism, really what we're getting at is that there's I would say that what is right or wrong differs from culture to culture, from person to person, and even sometimes within a person's particular circumstances. It would be this idea of moral relativism. And in other words, just as we were saying that if society that does not believe in God as the foundation of morality, there are no absolute or objective moral values is what the bottom line of moral relativism is. And that our morality can change through time based on circumstances. And so just a little comic there of this little tot was kind of hoping for a little moral relativism on their Christmas wish list. But Pope Benedict saw this even before he was elected Pope. He talked about this idea of a dictatorship of moral relativism. And here's a quote that we're moving towards that dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything as for certain and which has its highest goal as one's own ego and one's own desires. So it really is more about what I want, my ego, satisfying my desires, okay? So how many people have seen Willy Wonka, the old Willy Wonka? All right, so to me, when I hear this, I start thinking of Veruca Salt, right? I want it now, I want it my way, right? It's all about me, and not necessarily about what's right or wrong. If I scream loud enough, if I make a big enough stink, then everybody's going to have to acknowledge that I'm right and I get my way. But you probably can't see the link at the bottom. There's a lot of good resources out there for basically refuting or disproving moral relativism or having good arguments against it. The Catholic.com, a Catholic Answers site, has a good one if you just search on moral relativism. This idea really refutes itself. So the idea of like global relativism basically would be that there are no absolute truths. Well, that itself is contradictory, because you could say to somebody that says that to you, well, is it absolutely true that there is no absolute truth? So, it's self-refuting, that statement. Most people are not global relativists. They wouldn't say that there are no absolute truths. They would say, well, they'd be partially relativists. So there are absolute truths in some areas, like science, but not in all. And certainly most of them would not acknowledge any absolute moral truths. And because of that, now you'll hear this idea, they'll say, therefore, we shouldn't impose our morality on other people since they might have their own moral truth that's different from ours, but just as valid. So anybody heard that, like don't impose your morality or your ideas, right? Which sounds good, but the idea is that what they don't realize is that in saying something like that, of what you should or shouldn't do, they're implying truth there. So, if I say, Fred, you shouldn't do this, right? I'm saying that's wrong. I may not be saying that explicitly, but I'm implying that what he's doing is wrong, right? So if they're saying you shouldn't share your moral, your moral beliefs with somebody else, they're saying your moral beliefs are wrong, mine are right, right? So that itself is contradictory. They're not saying that they have that moral code, but it is something that they're implying. So that's contradictory. But probably the best evidence that refutes moral relativism is if somebody claimed to be truly moral relativistic, what do you think would happen if somebody broke into their house and stole a valuable possession? Would they, because the person didn't know that it was right or wrong, would they just let that go? I mean, the matter of fact is that practical experience is that no one is really truly relativistic when they themselves are wronged. They're going to cry out for justice, right? So there are many more resources out there, but it's just important because that's kind of the world we're living in right now, and that's a big change from just not too long ago. That really more and more people do kind of have an idea of that we should be more moral relativists and not believe in any kind of absolute truths. And I think some of this is because people look at morality as really just a big set of rules. We see rules everywhere, right? Don't do this, do that. And so they just look at it as like, well, it's all just about rules or people trying to control me. Well, I want to say, first of all, there is a place for rules. We need rules. We may not like it. We may want to rebel against it. Our freedom, our individualistic kind of spirit may kind of rebel against that. But just imagine for a moment if we didn't have any traffic rules. If I just said, you know what, Fred, when you go home tonight, just if you want to drive on the left-hand side of the road, you go ahead. Titus, you just, if you want to drive backwards 90 miles an hour, that's fine. That'll work. Who am I to impose my traffic rules on the rest of the folks around us, right? We'd probably end up with something crazy like this, right? We need rules, right? I mean, rules are important. They protect certain things that are really important, like our transportation system, right? And they are necessary. If we could just drive on sidewalks and just backwards, whatever, I mean, it would be complete chaos out there, right? So some rules are necessary. So rules get a bad rap, but we do need them. And something we don't think about too, just like another example for people that might be more musically inclined, imagine if you had a symphony where each person was just, I don't want to impose this score on you. We're all supposed to play together. Let's just throw that out. You play what you want to play. You play what you want to play. You play what you want to play. You want to play some jazz, Titus? That's fine, That would sound horrible, right? So just another kind of example of like sometimes there needs to be some agreement about what we're all going to do and what we're all not going to do, or else we can't get anything done, right? So rules themselves are not bad. But it's not just rules, but trying to move towards a loving relationship. And here, a passage from the Gospel according to Matthew. So, then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me." So one thing I want to point out is if, all right? That's something that we kind of skip over, but it is a choice, all right? That Jesus isn't imposing this on us, but it's about if we want to be his follower, then that's going to be turning away from, our Veruca Salt kind of tendencies of I want it now, it's all about me, right? And trying to take up our cross and follow him. Now, in order to do that, we've got to realize that this isn't just a one-time event, it's every day. Right? So if we go back to that timeline when we're making those decisions, it's not just once a day even, it's constantly through our lives, making those decisions of what is the best thing to do, what should I do here, what ought I do in this. And the way we can learn to do that is really, it's going to be kind of two things, right? We have to, with our intellect, we have to know God, we have to know about God, and what it is that he's revealed to us, and that's something we never will fully know, obviously, so we can keep learning through our lives, and we have to mentally agree to follow what God has laid out for us, right? So that's in the intellect. But what about in our will? Okay, so now we can know something, but now we've got to put it into action, put it into practice, our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. Obviously, not easy, right? But that's what it really comes down to. And here we think of even Christ there in the Garden of Gethsemane said, to his Father, not what I will, but what you will, okay? So he knew what was ahead for him, right? And he denied what he would rather do, which is the normal human tendency to not want to suffer, right? And he did his Father's will, even in the most difficult of circumstances. This reminds me, though, of St. Augustine. So even if we know something that we shouldn't do something, it's hard to actually put it into practice. And so, for those of you may already be familiar, but those of you who are not, with St. Augustine, part of his conversion is that he was still living an adulterous life. He knew that the woman he was living with, that he had a child with out of marriage, that he needed to not be living in that lifestyle, but it was very difficult, right? So there's this famous quote from his autobiography, The Confessions, "O Master, make me chaste and celibate, but not yet," because he wasn't quite ready there. Intellectually, he knew what he should be doing, but his will wasn't there yet, right? Again, moving from rules to love. So this gospel passage from Matthew. "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets.'" So you probably heard this, but at Jesus' time there were something like 613, I think, commandments, right? And some of the different factions would argue about which were the most important, but Christ really brings it back to the essentials. What is the most important thing? It's not about just the rules or who's observing the rules the best, or which rule do you want to emphasize, that kind of thing. For him, it really comes back to love. So loving God with all of our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength. And then from that, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And from that, if we get that right, then all of the other rules and commandments will come more naturally. But that has to be at the center, is that love of God and then love of neighbor. And then from that, all the other rules really will come naturally. So I want to get us to think about, again, moving beyond rules. And we're going to kind of go to a non-biblical example, okay? So if we think about a great sports figure, somebody like LeBron James, all right, is he going, now if he stops playing for a little while, goes to the bench, do you think he's pulling out the rule book, saying, okay, now wait a minute, how many steps can I take if I'm not dribbling? I can't remember, how many points is it if I shoot behind this arc here? How many points do I get? No, he knows the rules, obviously, inside and out, and he relies on the rules to be the kind of player he is. Imagine if there were no rules, right? If I'm the opposite coach and the Lakers put out 5 people on the court, I'm going to put 10 out. 5 of them are just going to guard LeBron James. The other 5 are going to guard the other guys, right? If there were no rules, you could do whatever you want. He couldn't be the player he is, again, without those rules, but he's not necessarily only focused on the rules. He needs the rules, the freedom to become the kind of player he is. And same kind of thing, like with a musician, like Wynton Marsalis, right? So here we have a guy who has trained so well and has learned different styles of music, jazz, classical music. So not to say that LeBron and Wynton aren't going back to the basics. Wynton's probably playing scales, and LeBron in practice is trying, working on free throws and things. That's important, but he's not just focused on that. It's about what the rules allow them to do because they're so well versed in them. Now, an example from the church. So, St. Maximilian Kolbe. How many people have heard of St. Maximilian Kolbe? Okay, a couple. So, St. Maximilian Kolbe was a Franciscan friar who was captured and put into a concentration camp. And he ended up still being very joyful, still sharing his faith with the other prisoners, even right up to the point where there was a situation where he ended up trading places with another prisoner who was a father and a husband, so that man might live. That man was going to be executed, and he said, "No, take me instead. I'm a Catholic priest. I don't have, any family, but he does." And so they actually did take him into his place. But he did that out of love. It's easy to think about doing what's right when everything is kind of easy and going our way. But in a circumstance like that, like a concentration camp, for him to still be sharing his faith, to be joyful, there was accounts of him being locked up in confinement with other prisoners, still singing the Psalms, giving praise to God. I mean, that's hard for me to even fathom in those kind of circumstances. But again, even when it was very difficult, he struggled through it and was still trying to live a moral and positive life. Of course, St. Teresa of Calcutta, who did so much for the poor, again, very difficult circumstances, and even her calling to do what she ended up doing with taking care of the poorest of the poor, after she said yes to God, at that point she felt a good, that God was very pleased with that. But then there's this now that's come out more recently where she had a period of very good dryness for decades after that, where she really wasn't getting any kind of affirmation, but yet she stuck with it, still helping those poor, still helping them to have that dignity oftentimes at the end of their life. And she was asked, well, how do you do that? And she said, the sisters, they would have Mass every day, and she said, well, I start off the day, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but I receive Christ in the Eucharist and receive his love, and then when I go to out to the street, I see that same Christ in everyone that I help, whether it's a child or an elderly person. She saw Christ, the same Christ she received in the Eucharist, in the face of that person who was in desperate need of help. Again, Mother Teresa, St. Maximilian Kolbe, not necessarily fixated on just rules. It's about them loving God and then showing that love to the people around them, even sometimes like with Maximilian Kolbe when it cost him his life. So this brings us to the concept of virtue. And so if we think about doing something that's good, we can think about it as like a one-time kind of thing. But when we make it into a habit, then this becomes this concept of virtue. So a virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. So if we do a good deed once, maybe it's helping out someone who's homeless, right? Like St. Teresa of Calcutta. If we do it once, it's still a beautiful thing. But doing it again and again, or treating somebody with respect again and again, it takes time, but it can become a habit. And what the Catechism in paragraph 1803 says is that this allows the person to not only perform good acts, but to give the best of himself or herself. And St. Gregory of Nyssa had this quote where he says, "The goal of a virtuous life is to become like God." And this quote from St. Paul in his letter to the Philippians, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So, we can grow in virtue by learning more about virtuous deeds, certainly reading the Bible. We'll talk about some other ways that we can grow in virtue in just a moment. A few paragraphs later, we have this idea of human virtue, specifically, again, getting back to that idea of getting our intellect and will so that our actions, our passions are ordered and according to reason and faith, so that we can begin to form those good habits, to do what's right, and to avoid what's wrong, okay? And this really, I think the second point is really important, because people nowadays kind of, again, like rules get a bad rap, but even this idea of virtue kind of gets a bad rap. Kind of people think that, well, that's just boring, right? But look at this second point here. Human virtue makes it possible ease, self-mastery, and joy in leading a morally good life. It really can be, because we're freely practicing the good deeds that we should be doing. Again, it doesn't come overnight. Just like becoming a virtuoso musician or a wonderful athlete takes a lot of work. It takes that time in the gym. It takes that time of if you're learning to play the guitar. I tried that for about 3 or 4 months, and my fingers were numb. They really hurt. Anything that if you're trying to grow in any kind of skill like that, takes a lot of work. And the same thing goes for virtue. And we can grow in them by education, learning more about the virtues, right? Deliberately trying to do them. Like once we know more about them, making it deliberate. Like today I'm going to focus on being more grateful, right? That kind of thing. Okay, and we'll talk more about specific virtues in a moment. But this third point, too, is thinking back to, like, say, with St. Maximilian Kolbe. It's easy to give up when we struggle, okay? We can do good deeds when it's easy, if we're with a group that's doing them, but when we're being ridiculed or when it's very difficult, that's where it's hard to do. And that's really what makes us grow in this way. And again, back to, like, the example of, like, an athlete. Sometimes athletes or anybody can learn more in a defeat or really screwing up than if things are going right? So even when it's a struggle, even when we might fail, that's sometimes the case where we can learn the most about what it takes to grow in virtue. So wanted to touch on the cardinal virtues, and these are virtues that they're called cardinal not because they're just practiced by cardinals in the church, but it comes from the idea of cardinal because that word cardinal means pivotal, and these are kind of like the root virtues that everything else relates to or hinges upon. And so all other virtues kind of relate to these. And so we have prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Now, those aren't words that are used a whole lot, so I've kind of tried to throw some other words up there that might be a little bit more familiar. So with prudence, basically what we're talking about is wisdom. So in a given situation, we have a pretty good awareness of what's really going on, and we can kind of see the consequences. If I do this, this is probably going to happen. If I do that, that's probably going to happen. And this can help us to choose the correct action then. With justice, fair treatment, okay? That's also, we think about justice to other people. That's certainly part of it, but it's also justice to God. So it's a resolve to give God and others their fair due. So acting fairly, respecting the rights of others. Fortitude, again, not a word we necessarily use a whole lot anymore, but we can think about it as like courage, okay? So just like we were talking about as persevering through struggles, fortitude or courage is very important in that kind of situation, right? So it's helping us to resist our temptations, be inconsistent in our choices and actions, and also if we're struggling with fears or facing some very difficult trials, it can help us through those, okay? And then again, temperance, not a word necessarily that's used a whole lot anymore, but we can think about it as like self-control, okay? Doing good things in moderation and realizing that everything, all created things always have to be secondary to God. It's not that there's necessarily things wrong with what God has created, but we have to order it rightly and put God first and everything else in creation second. And then again, from these cardinal virtues, everything else hinges on that. So what we used to do, and this is kind of a cheesy thing, but if it helps you remember, these are important. So we can pray for God to help us to grow. If you see one of those on there that maybe are struggling with or you'd like to grow in, ask God for help in that area. Maybe it's fortitude because you're going through some very difficult trials right now at work or at home or something. You can pray, God, help me to have the courage to make the right decisions. Or we could all use more prudence or justice, temperance. So to help you remember this, to help the 7th graders remember this, what I used to do is I said, all right, so we can think about prudence, peanut butter, justice, jelly, and then the FT from fortitude and temperance is French toast. All right, so anyway, peanut butter jelly French toast. So prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. That helps me remember it, those kind of things. So hopefully it'll help you too. Again, it's kind of cheesy, but they all have a theme of breakfast. So, all right. So from those virtues, those cardinal virtues, then all other virtues kind of come from that. And I'm going to touch on some. There's certainly more virtues than this, but these are pretty important ones. So first being humility. Now, a lot of people kind of have this idea of like humility is like just about kind of not thinking so highly of ourselves. And that's certainly part of it, but it's not thinking too lowly of ourselves either. In essence, it's really trying to see ourselves as God sees us. Or I also like this other way. It's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So it's not all about us, it's about what we're doing, everyone around us, how it affects them, that kind of thing. And again, seeing the gifts that God has given us, how we're called to use those, to share them with others, and not getting too inflated in our egos, but not beating ourselves up either. Patience, certainly a great virtue for even on your way home maybe, if you get into some, well, it won't be too much traffic now, but, for work, for dealing with kids. Again, I told you up front I have 2 teenagers, so patience is something that I need a lot of right now. Chastity, moderation of the desire for sexual pleasure according to the principles of faith and right reason. So that's at the stage we're at in life for those who are single or married, right? So, people have this idea that when you're in a married relationship that maybe chastity doesn't apply. It absolutely does. It's being true and faithful to your spouse. This next one is one that's so important. Can't stress it enough, but gratitude. It's so easy for us to take things for granted. I do this, we all do it all the time, right? But to really, in our prayer life, in our meditation, to think about how many gifts that we have versus even so many other people in the world today, right? We have been so blessed, and to be so thankful for the gifts we have, the freedoms we have, the talents that God has given us and how we can share those with others and so on, our family, our health. Generosity, so caring deeply for others and to treat them like you would like to be treated. And then last, again, something that kind of might sound something that you don't hear a lot, but piety and zeal. So really what that comes down to is love for the church, love for God, love for the sacraments, and so on. Taking those very seriously. Why these are important is because we can look at what's the flip side of that. So we've been talking about virtues. Now, if virtue is a habit of doing the right thing, the opposite of that would be vice. So if we think about repeated patterns of doing the wrong thing or sin, that can be a vice. And these can be things that we struggle with. So kind of the 7 deadly vices or sins would be pride, anger or wrath, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice, which isn't used a whole lot anymore, so I've just kind of said, well, that's basically like greed, and sloth or laziness. So I put them in this order to just compare with what we were just talking about. So with pride, a good antidote to that would be humility, anger or wrath, patience and love. Lust, a good counter to that would be chastity, and so on. So you can see that up there. The reason I put that up there, and there are lots of great resources out there about really diving into these, and what I have found so helpful is that if there's a particular vice that you're struggling with, start asking God for helping you to grow in the opposite virtue. If you're struggling with one of these, really ask for God's help. If it's pride, pray every day for humility, and also read up on it a little bit. Read some ways that maybe putting not just the idea and not just through prayer, but what are some concrete things that I can do to help me to grow in this particular area? That would be my advice. But also, you might be able to find, and I would recommend this, if there's a particular area or two that you struggle with, look for a saint that might have struggled with that too, and ask for their help. So just some advice there. So we were talking about, the cardinal virtues and like human virtues. I wanted to touch on theological virtues. So these would be in Catechism paragraphs 18, 12, and 13. These are called theological virtues because they come from God. They relate directly to God, and they help us to live in relationship with the Holy Trinity. They are the foundation for all Christian morality, and all the human virtues we've been talking about are really rooted in those as well. And so probably some of you already know what these three are, but we can talk about faith, which is the first theological virtue, belief in God and in all He has said and revealed to us, hope, desire for the kingdom of heaven, and trust in Christ's promises and not in our own strength, okay? Again, thinking about even like humility and some of these virtues, if we're trying to do it by ourselves, we're missing the point. We need Christ's help. We need grace to be able to grow in regular, like human virtues, in the cardinal virtues. And so that second part of that is very helpful, that Christ's promises, relying on Christ's grace to grow and to help us, and not in our own strength. We can't get there on our own. And then faith, hope, love, but I'm using the word charity here, but loving God above all things for His own sake, and again, our neighbors as ourselves for the love of God. So we've touched on this already, but it is important, how do we grow in virtue? And by growing in virtue, we're also growing in holiness. We're growing closer to God, closer to Christ. So this passage from Romans, I think, is helpful here, where St. Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." So again, think back to our example. Right is right even if no one else is doing it, and wrong is wrong even if everyone else is doing it. Do not conform ourselves to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of mind. So how are we transformed? How are our minds, how are our souls transformed? Prayer. It's huge. It's a huge, important part. If you're not currently spending a little bit of time in daily prayer, I'd really recommend it. It's transformative. Even 5 minutes a day, beginning of the day, the end of the day, at a time that's good for you. Personally, I try every morning to spend at least a half an hour. I just feel like my day, if I don't do that, I notice a huge difference of not spending that time in prayer every morning. And you can pray with the Holy Scriptures. If it seems awkward to be praying, for a long period of time, Dee, you've done like the Lectio Divina, so just, it's God's Word. Spend time in it, reading it very slowly and seeing, as Dee's pointed out, if there are certain words or phrases that stand out to you, what is God trying to say to you, maybe in a current thing that you're dealing with, right, at work or with your family, in the Holy Scripture. Studying the Church's teaching, again, a catechism is a great resource. And again, so, there's more information on particular virtues, particular, areas, maybe, quotes from the saints, that just so much information in there that might resonate with you. So if you're looking at wanting to learn more about some specific areas, there's a lot of good resources out there. And then also learning more about the lives of the saints. Like I mentioned earlier, if there's a particular thing that you're struggling with, there's probably a saint out there that was dealing with the same kind of struggle that you might be able to relate to. And so I really love Saint Therese of Lisieux, and her little way is I can relate to it because, you think about like trying to do these big, huge, heroic kind of things, acts of faith, and she had troubles with that too, but she said, I'm just going to try to do little things with great love, every single day. And, maybe that's just doing the dishes and tolerating, in her case, like a nun next to her that was driving her crazy, and just doing something for her. That's okay, and we can do that, we can relate to that like in our offices or whatever, just doing little things with love. And then can't emphasize enough how important, I know you guys have talked about the sacraments, but remember what the sacraments are, is that we're partaking of God's divine life. So if we want to grow in holiness, you can't grow wrong by really trying to make it to Mass frequently. And also, when we fall and screw up, reconciliation is so important to really help us to just know that we're forgiven, to hear those words of absolution, and to get back on the right path again, again, back to our analogy with the compass, it's recalibrating the compass, right? Getting us focused back on where we're trying to go. All right, so we're going to close with this kind of long passage, but I think it's a good one because it kind of brings a lot of this together. Since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the reality of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Again, so we're focusing on that true north of what Christ is calling us to. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in his glory. So put to death the sinful, earthly things lurking within you. So pause for a sec. Those vices, those kind of patterns that we have, we're called to kind of to do our best, again, through prayer, through reading the scriptures, to put those to death and to put those behind us. And then put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator. Again, pause. For our intellect, we want to learn more about God. We can't love God if we don't know him, right? So trying to inform ourselves. Become like him. That's what holiness is all about. Is really trying to let he's sharing his life in the divine sacraments. We're trying to grow in holiness. And in this new life, it doesn't matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us. Since God chose you to be the holy people, he loves you. You must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So again, he's naming some virtues that we want to try to grow in. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Not easy, I know, but it's also in the Lord's Prayer, so he really means it. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony, and let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace and always be thankful. Again, gratitude, super important. Let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives, and whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. So I think, as you learn more about these virtues and things, you just see that in so many parts of the New Testament, the Old Testament, there are elements there where you can see God trying to help us to grow in holiness and to again, remember what morality is not just about rules. It really is trying to lay the foundation so that we can live in excellence and to grow in holiness. And really that's about growing in these virtues. And so we get there by prayer and really spending time in the scriptures, learning more about God and what he's calling us to. So I just invite you to say this closing prayer with me. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Holy God, you are deserving of all our praise and love. We thank you for your loving sacrifice on the cross. Help us to grow in faith, hope, love, and all virtues. Help us to love you with all our heart, mind, soul, and to love our neighbors as you love us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. All right. So does anybody have any questions? That was a lot of material. We used to cover this over like 7 weeks in 7th grade, so trying to cram it down into like one talk, but you'll be going over more of this stuff, but I would be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.